On tonight's episode, we explore the horror of humanoid cryptid eyewitness sightings. However, we won't be alone. Reading with us is a very special guest, hailing from the United Kingdom, a Mr. Dead in the night. Lock your windows, lock your doors, and enter the alternate nightmare. I want to tell you about the single most terrifying thing I have ever experienced as a rookie cop. This messed me up so much that I left the force soon after. I couldn't cope afterward. I won't give any specifics, such as where this happened or an exact date. Even though I'm no longer on the job, there could still be repercussions somehow. God knows the nightmare shall be punishment enough. It started as a regular call from dispatch neighborhood called in saying that she had heard a commotion in the yard next door, and the sound of smashing glass. It was roughly 2 a.m. and had been loud enough to wake her up. She hadn't seen anything but thought that she'd heard a dog barking, which she'd also found weird. Since the neighbor she was reporting about did not have a pet, we were treating it as a possible break-in since the neighbor said the woman lived alone, so a domestic disturbance was likely, as usual. We were short on officers available for backup, with there already being a shooting that evening that had been taken out most of the shift, as they dealt with multiple perpetrators and witnesses, so it was just my partner and me. These kinds of calls were unusual, but since I was still kind of new, they always kept the adrenaline pumping. I'd only been in the job a couple of years, and I'd already seen 2 colleagues buried. We turn off the lights and sirens as we approach the property. My partner, whom we'll call Joe, went to the front door. I headed to the back. Thankfully, there was a porch light on, so it lighted the yard nicely. The neighborhood called it and had mentioned hearing a commotion. There was trash everywhere. It appeared like whoever had broken and had first emptied all the garbage cans and spread them all over the floor. Mindless destruction, or had they been looking for something? It was hard to tell. There was indeed a smashed window there. Usually, if somebody breaks a window, it's to reach through to an open door. I mean, anyone who watches a movie knows that. But this was a whole window taken out, and it looked like whoever had gone through it had done so in a hurry, as there was blood on the remaining glass, and what looked to be fair. I remember dispatch had mentioned a possible dog of a scene, but not belonging to the property owner. That seemed weird. Perps don't usually bring ship for walkies when casing a joint. Anyway, I push the door, and it opens. I radioed to Joe that I was going in, and we'll open the front door for him. As I check the kitchen, where the broken window is, there is now a trail of blood going all the way to the house. My gun is out, and I'm checking each room as I go through. But nothing. I let Joe in, and we head up the stairs, seeing more blood as we go to. It would be strictly a surprise if I said that I had a terrible feeling about this. Not that any call that involves trails of blood, and well, but there was an extra feeling that something was very, very wrong. I will admit, I was scared. The closer we got to the bedroom, the more intense this feeling grew, and I would even go so far as to say that I could sense evil in that house. Now, maybe that in hindsight, me looking back and adding memories of feelings, I can't know for sure, but I can tell you that what we found when we opened the bedroom door was the absolute epitome of evil. But just before we opened the door, we stood quietly outside it and listened just for a second or two to see if we could glean any extra information about where the perp might be in the room. We could hear what sounded like to people in there, 2 distinct sets of noises. One we assumed was the female of the property, and it said like the poor woman was wondering, but she was still able to make a noise and therefore be alive, which was a good sign. The second noise was more unusual, as it sounded like a heavy pant and a low growl. Now we knew there had been a report of a dog's being hurt, but why can we hear the second person? We busted to the door, guns out and ready, but I don't think we could have ever actually been prepared for what we saw. I know for sure that I will never forget it. There was a lot of blood to start with, and we weren't sure who it all belonged to. The woman was lying on the bed. The covers had been thrown off. They were piled in a heap on the floor. She was worn a 90, which had been pushed up, exposing her legs and panties. They were covered in blood. There was a large wound on one of her legs near her ankle, and it looked like God helped her like a bite mark. The sight of the blood wasn't the most shocking thing about her. It was the look of terror upon her face. And then we saw why I had rushed to the woman while Joe had remained by the door. and now the perp appeared from behind it. I will tell you exactly what it was, a dog, man. Let me describe this thing for you. I won't ever forget what he looked like since I see him every night in my dreams. I would guess around 6'5", very well built, strong as an ox, as my nonna would have said. Despite being covered in dark brown, rough-looking hair, you could see its muscles rippling through as it went to the gym. You think the rockin', but with fur. He wore no clothing, but the hair was all over, even on his face. He was bipedal, stood tall and proud, not like a dog who was begging, but like he was meant to be honest, 2 legs. His arms and legs were in proportion to his torso, although the components seemed to hang a little lower than humans would at the end of the powerful-looking legs, or large feet, each with a large curl. The claw, kind of like a talon, and at the end of each long arm was a large paw again, with razor-sharp-looking nails. That all led up to the head. If the body of this abomination was meant to resemble man by a shape, the head was 100% dog. I could have been looking into the face of one of our canine units. It was a German Shepherd for sure, which may be some wolf thrown in. The small pointy ears were pressed down. The long black snout was dripping. Small black eyes stared right at me. And the mouth was open, curled lips, and a snorkel to show a perilous set of teeth. It was now fresh blood all around them all. And that was when I also noticed more blood matting the hair on one side of its body. It must have been the blood trail that we had followed from the broken window. Now, I don't know about you, but when I watch a horror movie, and the hero doesn't bat an eye when they see the vampire or creature or werewolf or monster, just instinctively somehow knows what to do to kill them. If I met a nightmare in real life, I always thought to myself, I'd probably soil myself and run away or be completely frozen in fear. It's one thing to go onto autopilot and use your training when you're faced with a human, but there are no lessons at the academy about what to do when you meet a non-human foe. Suddenly, it leaped at me, and then I heard a bang. There was a flash, a howl, and a crash. Joe had managed to do one better than me and had come out of a shocked stupor. When the thing made to attack me and shot it, it had hit the beast and then smashed to the upstairs window into the garden below. In the few seconds it took to a lookout, it was gone. There was a load more blood and hair in the rosebush below the window where it had landed, but it was now gone. Training kicked in, and then we dealt with the victim, stemming the blood flow on her leg until the EMTs arrived, and the poor woman was traumatized, as you would expect. Thankfully, it had only been a physical attack, and I say only knowing full well just how traumatic the entire thing was. And believe me, if it had gone from sniffing to worse anyway, she was patched up and allowed to go home by then. I had already had the talk with the brass, told to change the statements, and told them party line was to be a human messed up on PCP, had broken and looking for cash. There was no such dog, man, so it wasn't long after that I left. And you know the absolute worst thing about the entire story? People know about this, and it's being covered up. These creatures, these predators, are natural, and nobody, for whatever reason, is allowed to talk about it.
About 20 years ago, I was living in an isolated cabin on the outskirts of a small town called La Loche, Saskatchewan. The house had been built by my grandfather many years before and was situated at the end of a long dirt road that needed the highway but then turned into another dirt road before reaching it. On one particular winter night, I heard something banging loudly against the back door. It continued to bang for several minutes, but eventually went away. After about an hour, I thought it strange that whatever made the racket hadn't returned, so I got up to investigate. But when I opened the door, it led right out onto the snow-covered ground. There were 4 sets of footprints leading away from my door. They didn't look human. They were approximate twice the size of human feet, whose stride was much too long for them to be any foot other than an ape. I followed the tracks to catch up with whatever was making them, but when I got to the main road, which ran parallel to the highway, there were no more tracks or signs that anything had come down it. Puzzled, I walked out onto the street and stared into the blackness toward where my house sat in case an animal might be coming down towards it. Suddenly, something landed on top of me. It squealed like a monkey and reeked like an open sewer as it began gnawing on my head through my winter cap. Fortunately, I'd been able to grab its wrists before it could get to my face. Thus I was able to prevent it from biting my face, but at the same time, couldn't quickly force it off me because of how vital the thing was. Eventually, with one hand still grabbing its wrists, and the other trying to keep my head out of its mouth, I managed to stand up. As soon as I did so, whatever was on top of me flipped over onto its back in front of me and snarled like an angry dog before taking off towards the highway again. That's when I finally got a good look at what had attacked me. An upright walking ape about 7 feet tall with grayish-white skin. It walked similarly to a gorilla, but had a hunched back, so it appeared more ape-like than gorilla-like. I could easily see its eyes in the moonlight, and they were entirely black with no white at all. So it wasn't a bear or some other dog-like animal that I'd never seen before. As far as I know, the creature is still out there somewhere. My sister owns land in Saskatchewan. On July 25, 2010, she went out to the shop around 6:00 a.m. and heard footsteps behind her. She turned around but saw nothing. Looked inside the shack, small building, and no one was there. She decided to go back inside her house to get something like a weapon or cellular phone. But when she returned only seconds later, only seconds it seemed, another set of footsteps approached from behind her on the concrete flooring. She ran back into the shop again, but saw that nothing was there again. Then she closed her eyes because she didn't want them to think that she could see them or hear them. So now they were following her through the thickets onto the grassy area next to where she lives. She couldn't get a signal on her phone, so she ran back inside the house and hid in a closet. The footsteps were going from one side of the house to another. She didn't have a way to call anyone, so she called me. I told her to go back outside and observe any devices they might have on their belts or on their backs. And then she saw that they all had black packs strapped onto their shoulders, with what looked like jet packs' back-mounted wings, but on top of the pack was something that looked like a laser gun, a weapon. They were very tall, over 7 feet, and very skinny and pale, and had no hair except for some long stringy hair over their ears. Their arms were long and lanky, but also muscular. One of them told her telepathically, "We don't want to hurt you." She didn't respond back because she was scared. Then a few seconds later they left. My sister said that it felt like there were 4 of them. 2 in the house and 2 outside, just watching her. The next day my brother went to clean his moose hunting stand on the place. It is about an hour from where she lives. He found 2-3 sets of footprints around some broken branches at the bottom of the tree right next to him. If he had been sitting under those trees, he would have been killed for sure, as those branches were lying on the ground. On July 31st, 2010, she went back to Saskatchewan, to her land. She saw 3 sets of those footprints under a tree right beside her shop. Then one set walked into a thicket and circled around where my brother sleeps when he goes hunting there every year. He has been going there for 10 years now, but he wouldn't go in that area because it was too dangerous. This sounds like what you have been talking about whenever we talk about UFOs or Bigfoot or whatever else is out there. My sister is scared to death. The individual requesting anonymity lives near Anchorage, Alaska, and contacted me after reading several articles at this website. The landowner also indicated they were being harassed by black helicopter sightings around their property. The location is approximately 30 miles southwest of the junction, between the Talkeetna Mountains and the Alaska Range, which includes Mount McKinley. The area where the landowner lives is in a lush forest with some spruce trees mixed in with other types of trees, while some are hardwoods such as birch, poplar, etc. Rivers are nearby about 1 mile away on 2 sides of her property. There are also lakes closer to her home that have trout in them according to what she told me. Saskatchewan has experienced its share of Bigfoot encounters over the years. In 1905 tales began circulating throughout Indian reservations near Prince Albert. Population 35,000. An ape-like creature up to 8 feet tall and weighing about 500 pounds was wandering around in the wilderness and attacking trappers. In 2009, I just got a new job, not many friends, just me and my cat. I was told by the guy who showed us the house that there was an old abandoned shack right behind it. So if I needed privacy, go ahead. One night around 10 p.m., I came home from work. All of a sudden, I heard screaming, growling noises coming from behind my house. So I went to confront whatever was out there. When I got back to my house, the growling noise stopped. I called out saying, "Hello, is anyone out here?" There was no response, but something at this point weird happened. My cell phone, which usually takes forever to charge, had fully charged in 15 minutes. That's when I said screw this and grabbed a knife with a flashlight and went for a walk. When I got to the other side of my house, the growling noises started again. I could tell whatever was making this noise was no more than 20 ft away from me. The forest behind my house is not dense and has very little tree coverage, so I could see pretty far back there. But what I saw was unbelievable. At first glance, it looked like an ape except that it had long arms to its knees, 3 ft longer than usual. And that's when it noticed me too. It made eye contact with me for about 1 min until it decided to run at me. It ran on 2 legs when it did this, but also lifted its arm, hands/paws into the air. When it got to me, I don't remember much except that I was in shock, and when I turned around to run, blood started gushing out of my nose. My neighbor, who heard the commotion, came over to check on me. And after I told him what happened, he advised me not to report this. I have lived here for 2 years now, and have had several strange things happen, including something trying to get into my house at night.
This is tough for me to talk about, but I need to do something about it. My wife and kids don't know I'm telling you this, but I want it out there because maybe someone else can learn from our experience. In 2012, we rented a small cabin in Heather Point on Spalding Lake in Saskatchewan, Canada, near Hudson Bay. For those who aren't familiar with the area, it's right on the lake between many other cabins. The place was very rundown and cheap, no phone service, no TV, etc. That didn't bother us, though. We just wanted to get away for some peace and quiet so my family could enjoy nature. On our second day at the kitchen table having dinner when my 6-year-old daughter said she had seen a man when we first went inside to look around. She described him as taller than Dad, with long straight black hair to his shoulders and very thin. We all laughed it off, thinking she was messing with us, but little by little, she would mention this strange man about half a dozen times in the next few days. It was odd because my wife and I both agreed she's usually not one to make up stories like that, so we made a joke out of it and would ask her who the man was now and then. One night my son woke around 3 a.m. from sleeping on the couch at the living room entrance, saying he heard someone walking outside near our car. He said they walked around the car on the gravel road, went up to our cabin door, and knocked real loud for about 30 seconds. He said he couldn't get out of bed because he was afraid, but they walked away when they didn't answer. My wife had stayed up late watching some TV in the living room, and she swore she didn't hear anything, and I believe her. My daughter would end up mentioning this man no less than 4 times over the next couple of days, with more details each time. One day it got so bad my wife convinced her to draw a picture of him. This is what she drew. A tall human-like figure with long dark hair parted down the middle, sharp thin face with big eyes, no tears, and naked. She was also adamant that he had something on his head that looked like antlers or horns coming out of it. She said they looked like deer antlers, but more like elk. Each time my daughter would talk about this man, we would casually dismiss it until one night when she said he came into our cabin looking for food. My wife tried to convince her she must have been dreaming, but my daughter insisted with wide eyes full of terror that he came right in. Through the window, we all went outside to look around but didn't find anything. The next night we brought some mousetraps out and set them up. About a week into being there, my wife's brother visited us from Anchorage with his family for a few days. On the second day of his visit, while I was out on a boat ride with him and some other guy, my daughter said she saw the man come back again. This time she said he had been watching us from behind a tree by our place while we all fished off the deck. She described him as standing on 2 legs this time, but that his hair was still parted down the middle, and he still looked skinny with antlers coming out of his head. She said he had watched for about an hour before heading back into the woods. My daughter also mentioned that she saw him standing on our car once, too. It's a black car, so I couldn't see if there was someone on it or not, but my wife and I both agree we didn't leave anyone up there. Another night, my son woke up again at 3 a.m. to the sound of wood chips being knocked off our grill by something heavy landing nearby. He got out of bed to take a look outside and told me he thought he saw a tall person walk past our cabin from behind with long hair, but that they were going away from the lake toward the other side where the trails are. I was too tired to go out and look, but I did hear a weird wood knocking sound outside the next day. The same night, my son also woke up because he heard something in our hallway. He says it sounded like a heavy person walked right past him toward the bathroom, then stopped and watched him for a while before going back around the corner into the living room where we keep our couches set up. That morning, we all went outside to check on some traps we had put down overnight but found nothing again. Anyway, long story short, here's what happened on Sunday. I was sleeping in late after fishing all night while my wife and brother-in-law took my nephew out hiking with them on some trails by our place. My daughter woke up early and started playing outside. She came running in when she said a man dressed in black walked right toward her from the corner of our cabin toward the lake. He had long hair parted down the middle again and antlers coming out of his head. But this time, she said he was more significant, taller, and walked on 2 legs like a human with big feet that left imprints in the dirt when he walked. She said he also had red eyes that were dark red, not bright or glowing, but red. My wife came rushing upstairs to tell me about it while I was still half asleep, so I quickly jumped up to look around outside. We didn't see anything, but we were getting ready to go out for breakfast, so we left the house unlocked just in case he came back while we were gone. We got our food at the restaurant and headed home after, but when we walked into our cabin around noon, our food was thrown all over the kitchen floor. Our stove was smashed on its side, all of the cooking pans were spread out everywhere, but nothing else looked like it had been touched. The door was still locked tight with no sign of forced entry anywhere. I've heard Sasquatch isn't violent or dangerous, but this sure felt like an invasion to me, especially after what my daughter said she saw him doing earlier that morning. It spooked all of us, and my nephew was traumatized. I called a paranormal investigator friend from Minnesota who said he'd ship me a couple of boxes of essential equipment for an overnight ghost hunt. After getting it all set up, my brother-in-law took off fishing with some friends again while my wife, daughter, son, and I spent the night in our cabin to see what happened. Meanwhile, his buddy was camping nearby with his kids on the other side of the lake. Anyway, we had been keeping ourselves busy watching TV on the couch when we heard loud popping noises coming from outside around 11 p.m. My brother-in-law, who was still out fishing, started texting me photos he took of his camping buddy's kids while they were out fishing on the lake with him. When I looked at the photos, I noticed someone standing right behind them in one of them. It was a tall, lanky, pale humanoid with long hair parted down the middle and antlers on its head. My brother-in-law said he didn't notice it while taking the photo, but his friend did see something around that time, but it seemed to vanish before they could get a better look. I believe this took place sometime between 1950 to 1955, when my uncle's dad owned one of the houses on this slight stretch of road that ran alongside a dammed-up lake. All the men in town were putting in an extension to an older dock already there for fishing and other recreational activities. This included my uncle's dad. My uncle was a young teen at the time, maybe 13 or 14 years old, and his older brother Steve had gone to live with their mother in Calgary after she divorced their father. They were not living on the farm anymore, probably only about 5 miles from Joe Average place. So it left both of them alone since they were each out building their own house while saving up some cash to get Steve from Calgary when he graduated high school in a couple of years. Right before this all happened, these red-tailed hawk birds had started going crazy over where the extension to the dock was being built. The builders had no idea why, but all of them figured it might be due to some endangered or threatened species around that area. But whatever it was, they didn't care because they were just happy someone else could find it instead of trying to hunt for something they would never find in the first place. Then one fateful evening, right before dark, when these men were starting to pack up their tools and call it a day, my uncle's dad started hearing something thunderous, walking back and forth across the lake bed towards his direction. He dismissed this at first, thinking that maybe what he heard was someone out for a late jog or perhaps kids messing around just about ready to come home from school since this whole stretch of road was in the same town. At first, he thought it might be someone local who lived nearby since all these houses were built on Formanus 5-acre plots of land. Still, then when he looked closer and saw that whoever was coming closer to him had highly long legs with skinny arms and fingers, he knew immediately this wasn't some local fellow out for a late jog or kids messing around after school. My uncle's dad called his co-workers over to where they were standing because this jogger was getting much too close for comfort. And if you've ever seen how fast people can run away from an alligator back in Florida, you get the idea. Since my uncle's dad was a practical man, he never said anything about seeing a guy with wings. And being in Alaska, no one would have taken him seriously if he did start telling ghost stories to his friends in front of their wives and kids. His reasoning for this is that taking what they saw in a positive light means there isn't anything to worry about from whatever they saw. So he just kept quiet, assuming this thing didn't have any interest in them. But maybe it did have an interest in the tools they left behind so quickly. Well, when the guys finally got together, they walked out towards where all the noise was coming from, thinking someone had broken into the equipment shed that held all their tools. When they got to the edge of the forest looking over into the lake bed, this huge thing was leaning against the wall, which now had a big hole smashed right through it. It was getting dark at this point, so all they could see was an extremely tall, lanky human-like figure standing there with its back towards them, staring out through what used to be their new dock extension. They quickly turned on their flashlights and started shining them on whatever it was, hoping for it to turn around. One of the guys said he saw long stringy hair hanging down past its shoulder blades, almost like dreads. But my uncle is pretty sure that dreads aren't a word and that my uncle's dad must have said it wrong. The other guy shining his flashlight on the thing started to say out loud, "What are you?" or something like that. And as soon as he finished saying this, the creature turned around and looked right at them. The two men were pretty amazed by what they saw since all they could see in the dark were extremely dreamy eyes glowing back at them from across the lake bed, which now seemed so much bigger than before. They didn't know what to do about anything at first, so they just stood there staring back, waiting for whatever it was to turn away first. Eventually, after a couple of minutes, they could hear loud flapping noises coming from behind them, and it sounded like a whole flock of seagulls. They immediately turned around to see what was happening behind them, only to find that the noise they heard was coming from hundreds of bats flying out from under the dock where they had been working all day. It was at this moment when both men started screaming as loud as they could, "It's a ghost," or something like that, and quickly taking off running back towards their house as fast as possible, yelling as they ran. It freaked the women and kids watching all along, thinking some terrible creature had followed them home. And by looking closely at my uncle's dad today, I would say it looks like he got more than his share of fleeing for that first move they made to leave. Nevertheless, they got back safe and sound, ready to tell everyone what had happened. However, they never told my uncle's dad anything about seeing any ghost. So nonetheless, he moved away with his family to Alaska, where I grew up, hearing no mention of him having ever seen or experienced any paranormal activity. Now let me interject here by saying that if my uncle told me this story as an adult, then obviously, whatever was following them home turned out to be more than just a ghostly encounter. And I believe that whoever or whatever it is that follows people home will only stalk you until you've left the country, state, town divided by etc. But once you're far away from that place or claimed by another entity, these entities will no longer be able to stalk you. So, where did the story end? Well, my uncle's dad got a job working in a mine outside of Fairbanks, Alaska, and eventually started his own family there, where he survived until he passed on at the age of 70. So what do I think this creature was that my uncle said his dad saw? If you enjoyed tonight's episode, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Also, if you enjoyed Dead's narrating, be sure to follow him on his YouTube channel. There's a link in the description below. I'll see you all in the next terrifying adventure.